Detective Robert Hayes thought he owned the streets. For 15 long years, he had walked through the city like he was untouchable. Other cops respected him, feared him, or stayed out of his way. The criminals knew his name and whispered warnings about him in dark corners. But what most people didn't know was that Hayes had a secret. He wasn't the hero he pretended to be. Hayes worked in the downtown precinct where the buildings were old and the neighborhoods were tough. Most of the people living there were Black and Hispanic families who worked hard just to get by. They ran small shops, cleaned office buildings at night, and sent their kids to school hoping for something better. But Hayes saw them differently. To him, they were all potential criminals. Over the years, Hayes had built a reputation. His arrest numbers were always high. His conviction rate was impressive. The department loved him because he seemed to get results. What they didn't see was how he got those results. Hayes had learned to bend the rules, then break them completely. He planted evidence when he needed it. He changed witness statements to fit his story. He lied in court reports without blinking an eye. The young officers who worked with Hayes noticed things. They saw him slip small bags of drugs into people's pockets during searches. They watched him threaten witnesses until they said what he wanted to hear. But nobody spoke up. Hayes was powerful, and speaking against him could end a career before it started. So they stayed quiet and looked the other way. Hayes had gotten away with it for so long that he stopped being careful. He thought he was smarter than everyone else. He believed his badge made him untouchable. That confidence would soon become his biggest mistake. The case that would change. Everything started on a Tuesday morning in March. A college student named David Thompson was walking home from his job at the campus library. David was 22 years old, studying computer science and working 2 part-time jobs to pay for school. He had never been in trouble with the law. He didn't drink, didn't do drugs, and barely had time for a social life between his studies and work. David was walking down Maple Street when Hayes pulled up beside him. The young man was wearing his work uniform and carrying his backpack full of textbooks. To anyone else, David looked exactly like what he was, a hard-working student heading home after a long day. But Hayes saw something else. He saw an opportunity. Hayes got out of his patrol car and called David over. The young man was confused but cooperative. He answered Hayes's questions politely, showed his ID when asked, and explained where he was going. Everything should have been fine. David had done nothing wrong, and Hayes had no real reason to detain him. But Hayes was having a slow month. His arrest numbers were down, and his supervisor had been asking questions. He needed a bust, and David was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Hayes made a decision that would haunt him later. He decided to create a crime where none existed. First, Hayes told David to empty his backpack. The young man complied, spreading his textbooks, notebooks, and laptop on the hood of the patrol car. Hayes searched through everything twice, finding nothing suspicious. Then he told David to turn around and put his hands on the car for a pat-down search. This is where Hayes made his move. While David faced away from him, Hayes quietly slipped a small plastic bag from his pocket. The bag contained what looked like cocaine, though it was actually baking soda that Hayes used for situations like this. In one smooth motion, he dropped the bag into David's backpack and zipped it closed. Then Hayes stepped back and announced loudly that he was going to search the backpack again. David was confused because they had already done that, but he didn't argue. Hayes opened the bag and pretended to be surprised when he found the planted drugs. He arrested David on the spot for possession with intent to distribute. David was shocked. He kept saying there had been a mistake, that the drugs weren't his, that he had never seen them before. Hayes just smiled and read him his rights. Another successful arrest for Detective Hayes. Another life destroyed by his lies. At the police station, Hayes wrote his report. He claimed that David had been acting suspicious, that he had tried to run when approached, and that the drugs were found in plain sight in his backpack. None of it was true, but Hayes had written so many false reports that the lies came easily. David spent the night in jail, confused and scared. His parents couldn't afford a good lawyer, so he was assigned a public defender who barely had time to read his case. The prosecutor who was supposed to handle the trial was known for taking plea deals rather than fighting cases. Everything was set up for David to be convicted and sent to prison. But then something unexpected happened. The original prosecutor had to step down from the case because of a family emergency. A new prosecutor was assigned, someone Hayes had never dealt with before. someone who had a reputation for being thorough and asking hard questions. The new prosecutor was a woman named Kelly Rivers. She was 35 years old, had graduated at the top of her law school class, and had spent the last 10 years building a reputation as someone who cared more about justice than conviction rates. Rivers was known for digging deep into cases, checking every detail, and never taking a police report at face value. When Rivers got David's case file, something didn't feel right to her. She had prosecuted hundreds of drug cases, and this one was different. David had no criminal history, good grades, steady employment, and strong family support. He didn't fit the profile of someone who would suddenly start dealing drugs. Rivers decided to investigate further. She requested all the evidence, including the police car's dashboard camera footage. She interviewed the arresting officers and asked for detailed timelines. She visited the scene where the arrest happened and talked to people in the neighborhood. What she found made her suspicious. The dashboard camera had mysteriously malfunctioned during the arrest. There were no witnesses to corroborate Hayes' story about David acting suspicious. The evidence bag had some irregularities in how it was sealed and documented. Most importantly, Rivers found security camera footage from a nearby store that showed the entire arrest. The footage clearly contradicted Hayes' report. It showed David cooperating fully, never trying to run, and Hayes acting in ways that didn't match his written statement. Rivers realized she wasn't just looking at a simple drug case. She was looking at what might be a case of evidence planting and police corruption. If she was right, an innocent young man was about to be sent to prison for a crime he didn't commit. And if Hayes had done this once, how many other times had he done it? Rivers made a decision that would change both her career and Hayes' life forever. Instead of offering David a plea deal like most prosecutors would have done, she decided to take the case to trial. She was going to expose what Hayes had done, even if it meant going up against a decorated police officer with 15 years of experience. Hayes had no idea what was coming. He thought this would be just another easy conviction, another victory to add to his record. He had no clue that Prosecutor Rivers was about to turn his world upside down. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and justice was finally coming for Detective Robert Hayes. Kelly Rivers had always believed that the truth was like water. It always found a way to surface no matter how deep someone tried to bury it. As she sat in her office late at night, surrounded by boxes of evidence from David Thompson's case, she knew she was onto something big. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she carefully examined every piece of paper, every photograph, and every statement in the file. Rivers had built her career on being thorough. While other prosecutors rushed through cases to meet deadlines, she took the time to understand every detail. Her colleagues sometimes called her obsessive, but Rivers preferred to think of herself as careful. In her 10 years as a prosecutor, this attention to detail had helped her solve cases that others had given up on. The David Thompson case had landed on her desk by accident. The original prosecutor had to leave suddenly when his father had a heart attack. Rivers was asked to take over just 2 weeks before the trial was supposed to start. Most prosecutors would have simply reviewed the basics and offered a plea deal. But something about this case bothered Rivers from the moment she opened the file. David Thompson didn't look like a drug dealer. His college records showed excellent grades. His professors described him as quiet, respectful, and hardworking. His employer at the campus library said he was reliable and trustworthy. His family had no history of criminal activity. Everything about David suggested he was exactly what he appeared to be, a good kid trying to make something of himself through education and hard work. Then, there was Detective Hayes. Rivers had never worked with him before, but she had heard his name around the courthouse. Other prosecutors spoke of him as someone who always got his man, someone whose cases were easy to prosecute because his evidence was always solid. But as Rivers dug deeper, she began to notice patterns that troubled her. Hayes had an unusually high arrest rate in drug cases. His reports were always detailed and convincing. His evidence was always perfectly documented. In 15 years, not one of his major cases had been overturned on appeal. On the surface, this looked like the record of an excellent police officer. But to Rivers, it looked almost too perfect. Rivers decided to visit the scene of David's arrest. Maple Street was a quiet residential area near the college campus. Students walked this route every day, going to and from work and classes. It was well lit with several businesses nearby. It didn't seem like the kind of place where someone would openly deal drugs. She talked to the owner of the corner store where David had bought a snack just minutes before his arrest. The store owner remembered David because he came in several times a week. He was always polite, always paid in exact change, and always seemed to be in a hurry to get somewhere. The owner was shocked to hear about the arrest. The security camera at the store became Rivers's first breakthrough. The footage showed David leaving the store and walking normally down the street. There was nothing suspicious about his behavior. He wasn't looking around nervously or trying to avoid being seen. He was just a young man walking home from work. But the most important part of the footage came next. It showed Detective Hayes' patrol car pulling up beside David. Rivers watched the encounter carefully, timing every moment. What she saw didn't match Hayes' report at all. According to Hayes' written statement, David had been acting suspicious when he first spotted him. Hayes claimed David was walking in an unusual pattern, looking around nervously, and appeared to be under the influence of something. But the security footage showed David walking normally, checking his phone once and showing no signs of unusual behavior. Hayes also claimed that David tried to run when he approached him. The footage clearly showed this was false. David stopped immediately when Hayes called to him and cooperated fully throughout the encounter. He stood calmly while Hayes searched his backpack the first time, finding nothing. Then came the moment that made Rivers's heart race. The security camera captured Hayes positioning himself between David and the backpack during the pat-down search. For about 30 seconds, Hayes' body blocked the view of the backpack. When he stepped away and searched the bag again, suddenly there were drugs inside. Rivers watched this sequence over and over, making notes and timing each movement. She was certain now that she was looking at evidence planting. Hayes had used David's cooperation against him, using the moment when David couldn't see his backpack to plant the incriminating evidence. But security footage alone might not be enough to convince a jury. Rivers needed more evidence, and she needed to understand if this was an isolated incident or part of a pattern. She began researching Hayes' other cases, looking for similarities and inconsistencies. What she found was disturbing. Over the past 5 years, Hayes had arrested an unusually high number of young Black and Hispanic men for drug possession. In almost every case, the suspects had no prior criminal history. In almost every case, the evidence was found in backpacks or pockets during searches. In almost every case, the suspects claimed the drugs weren't theirs. Rivers pulled the files for 12 of Hayes' recent cases. She found that in 10 of them, the dashboard camera in Hayes' patrol car had either malfunctioned or been turned off during the crucial moments of the arrest. This was supposedly due to technical problems, but the pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. She also noticed that Hayes almost always worked alone during these arrests. Most police officers preferred to have backup for drug arrests, but Hayes seemed to prefer handling these situations by himself. This gave him the privacy he needed to plant evidence without witnesses. Rivers began making phone calls to defense attorneys who had handled Hayes' cases. Most had encouraged their clients to take plea deals rather than fight the charges in court. When Rivers explained what she had discovered, several attorneys expressed regret about not investigating further. They had trusted Hayes' reputation and assumed the evidence was legitimate. One attorney, however, had always suspected something was wrong. He represented a teenager named Carlos who had been arrested by Hayes 2 years earlier. Carlos had maintained his innocence throughout the process, but his family couldn't afford to fight the case, so he took a plea deal for a reduced sentence. The attorney still had Carlos's file and agreed to meet with Rivers. What he showed her was another piece of the puzzle. Carlos's arrest followed the same pattern as David's. A young man with no criminal history walking alone, suddenly found with drugs after Hayes conducted a search. The dashboard camera had malfunctioned and there were no witnesses. Rivers realized she wasn't just defending David Thompson anymore. She was potentially uncovering a systematic pattern of police corruption that had sent innocent people to prison. Young men like David and Carlos, who should have been building their futures, had instead been trapped in the criminal justice system by Hayes' lies and planted evidence. The weight of this discovery was enormous. If Rivers was right, Hayes had destroyed multiple lives over the years. Families had been torn apart, educational opportunities had been lost, and innocent people had been branded as criminals, all so Hayes could maintain his reputation as a tough cop. who always got results. Rivers knew that taking on a decorated police officer would be dangerous for her career. Hayes was popular with other cops, respected by judges, and had powerful friends in the department. If she accused him of corruption and couldn't prove it convincingly, her reputation would be destroyed. She might never prosecute another case, but Rivers also knew she couldn't stay silent. David Thompson was counting on her to prove his innocence. Carlos and others like him deserved to have their stories told. The community deserved to know that a police officer they trusted had been betraying that trust for years. Rivers made her decision. She was going to trial, and she was going to expose Detective Hayes for what he really was. She would present the security footage, the pattern of suspicious arrests, and the inconsistencies in his reports. She would show the jury that Hayes was not the hero he pretended to be, but a corrupt officer who planted evidence to boost his arrest numbers. The trial was scheduled to begin in 1 week. Rivers worked around the clock to prepare her case, knowing that she would have only one chance to get it right. Hayes had no idea what was coming for him. He thought he was walking into another routine trial where his word would be accepted without question. He was about to learn that his 15-year run of getting away with corruption was coming to an end. Justice was finally catching up with Detective Robert Hayes, and Prosecutor Kelly Rivers was going to make sure he faced the consequences of his actions. The courthouse was buzzing with unusual energy on the morning of David Thompson's trial. Word had somehow gotten out that something big was about to happen, though most people didn't know exactly what. The hallways were filled with more reporters, police officers, and curious onlookers than a typical drug possession case would normally attract. Detective Robert Hayes walked through the courthouse doors feeling confident and relaxed. He wore his best suit and his most serious expression. In his mind, this was just another day at the office. He had testified in hundreds of cases over his 15-year career, and he knew exactly how these things went. He would tell his story, the jury would believe him, and another criminal would be sent where they belonged. Hayes had barely glanced at the case file the night before. Why should he? He knew his story by heart because he had lived it. Or at least he had lived the version of it that he told in court. The real version, the one where he planted drugs in an innocent student's backpack, was something he had pushed so far back in his mind that he almost believed his own lies. As Hayes settled into the witness waiting room, he chatted casually with other officers who were there for different cases. They all knew his reputation and treated him with respect. Several younger officers asked for advice about testifying, and Hayes was happy to share his wisdom. He told them to stick to the facts, speak clearly, and never let a defense attorney rattle them. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, Prosecutor Kelly Rivers was making final preparations for what she knew would be the most important case of her career. She had barely slept in the past week, going over every detail of her strategy. Her opening statement was memorized, her questions for Hayes were carefully planned, and her evidence was organized perfectly. Rivers looked across the courtroom at David Thompson, who sat nervously beside his court-appointed defense attorney. David was wearing a borrowed suit that was slightly too big for him, and his hands shook slightly as he turned pages in a legal pad. His parents sat in the front row behind him, looking scared and confused. They had worked double shifts for weeks to try to afford a better lawyer, but it hadn't been enough. The defense attorney was a tired-looking man named James Wright, who handled dozens of cases like this every month. He had encouraged David to take a plea deal, warning him that fighting a police officer's testimony was usually hopeless. When David refused and insisted on his innocence, Wright had reluctantly agreed to go to trial, though he clearly expected to lose. Wright had no idea that Rivers was about to do most of his work for him. In all his years of practice, he had never seen a prosecutor work so hard to prove a defendant's innocence. He assumed Rivers was just being thorough in preparation for what she expected would be an easy conviction. Judge Patricia Martinez called the court to order at 9 o'clock sharp. She was a fair but tough judge who had been on the bench for 12 years. She had seen thousands of drug cases and had developed a reputation for running an efficient courtroom. She expected lawyers to be prepared and witnesses to tell the truth. Judge Martinez had worked with Rivers on several cases and respected her thoroughness and integrity. She had also seen Hayes testify many times and had always found him to be a credible witness. She had no reason to expect that this case would be any different from the hundreds of similar cases she had overseen. Rivers delivered her opening statement with calm confidence. She told the jury that they would hear evidence of a young man's innocence and a police officer's betrayal of public trust. She promised to show them video evidence, inconsistencies in police reports, and a pattern of questionable arrests. The jury listened intently, surprised by the prosecutor's unusual approach. Wright gave a brief opening statement, simply asking the jury to keep an open mind and consider all the evidence before making their decision. He still didn't fully understand what Rivers was planning, but he was smart enough to stay out of her way and let her work. Then it was time for Hayes to take the stand. He walked to the witness box with the confident stride of someone who had done this many times before. He raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. The irony of that moment would soon become clear to everyone in the courtroom. Rivers began her questioning gently, asking Hayes about his background and experience. He proudly described his 15 years of service, his commendations, and his dedication to keeping the community safe. He spoke about the challenges of police work and the importance of getting dangerous drugs off the streets. Hayes described the night he arrested David Thompson, sticking closely to the story he had written in his report. He said he had been patrolling the area when he noticed David acting suspiciously. According to Hayes, David was walking in an unusual pattern, looking around nervously, and appeared to be under the influence of something. Hayes testified that when he approached David, the young man seemed extremely nervous and tried to avoid making eye contact. He claimed that David's hands were shaking and that he was sweating despite the cool evening air. All of these were signs, Hayes explained to the jury, that suggested someone was carrying illegal substances. The detective described searching David's backpack and finding nothing during the first search. He said this wasn't unusual because drug dealers often hid their products very carefully. That's why he decided to conduct a second, more thorough search. During the second search, Hayes testified, he found a plastic bag containing what appeared to be cocaine hidden in a pocket of the backpack. Hayes spoke with the confidence of someone telling the truth. His voice was steady, his answers were detailed, and he looked directly at the jury as he spoke. To anyone who didn't know better, he seemed like exactly what he claimed to be, an experienced police officer doing his job and protecting the community from dangerous criminals. The jury listened carefully to Hayes's testimony. Several of them took notes, and most seemed impressed by his professionalism and apparent dedication to his work. A few jurors glanced over at David Thompson, probably wondering how such a young, innocent-looking person could be involved in drug dealing. Wright conducted a brief cross-examination, asking Hayes a few basic questions about his procedures and the evidence. Hayes answered confidently, showing no signs of nervousness or uncertainty. Wright seemed satisfied and concluded his questioning quickly, apparently seeing no weaknesses in Hayes's story. But Rivers wasn't finished with Detective Hayes. As Wright sat down, she stood up and approached the witness stand with a stack of papers and a laptop computer. The courtroom fell silent as she prepared to begin her own cross-examination. Judge Martinez looked at Rivers with slight confusion. It was unusual for a prosecutor to cross-examine their own witness so extensively. Normally, prosecutors asked a few follow-up questions and moved on to their next witness. But Rivers had specifically requested extra time for her examination of Hayes. Hayes felt the first small flutter of nervousness as Rivers opened her laptop and positioned it so he could see the screen. He had expected to be done testifying by now, ready to go home and add another successful conviction to his record. Instead, he found himself facing more questions from the prosecutor who was supposed to be on his side. Rivers's first question was simple. Detective Hayes, you testified that your dashboard camera was not working on the night you arrested David Thompson. Is that correct? Hayes confirmed that yes, there had been technical problems with the camera that night. He explained that these things happen sometimes with older equipment, and there was nothing he could do about it. Rivers nodded and made a note. Then she asked about Hayes's other recent arrests, specifically how many times his dashboard camera had malfunctioned during drug arrests. Hayes became slightly defensive, insisting that he couldn't control when equipment failed. The questioning continued for another hour, with Rivers methodically working through inconsistencies and timeline problems in Hayes's testimony. She asked about his procedures for documenting evidence, his methods for conducting searches, and his interactions with suspects during arrests. Hayes found himself sweating slightly as Rivers's questions became more pointed and specific. He had expected this to be routine, but instead he felt like he was being interrogated. Several times he had to pause and think carefully about his answers, trying to remember what he had written in his report months earlier. The courtroom atmosphere began to change as Rivers continued her examination. What had started as a routine drug case was clearly becoming something much more serious. Hayes's confidence was slowly cracking, and even he was beginning to realize that Prosecutor Rivers knew far more about his case than he had expected. As the morning session came to an end, Judge Martinez called for a lunch recess. Hayes left the witness stand feeling shaken and confused. For the first time in his career, he was beginning to worry about his testimony. He had no idea that the afternoon session would be far worse, and that Rivers was just getting started with her devastating attack on his credibility and his crimes. After the lunch break, Detective Robert Hayes returned to the witness stand looking noticeably less confident than he had that morning. During the recess, he had tried to call his union representative and his supervisor, but both were in meetings. He had also attempted to review his case notes, but Prosecutor Kelly Rivers had been asking questions about details he had never expected anyone to challenge. The courtroom was more crowded now than it had been in the morning. Word was spreading through the courthouse that something unusual was happening in Judge Martinez's courtroom. Several off-duty police officers had slipped in to watch, along with more reporters and curious attorneys who had finished their own cases for the day. Rivers stood up to continue her cross-examination with a calm expression that hid her determination. She had spent the lunch break reviewing her notes and preparing for the most crucial part of her questioning. Everything she had worked for over the past week was about to come together in the next hour. Hayes settled uncomfortably in the witness chair as Rivers approached with her laptop and a manila folder full of documents. He could feel sweat starting to form on his forehead despite the courthouse's air conditioning. Something about the prosecutor's demeanor had changed during the break. She seemed more focused, more intense. Rivers began the afternoon session by asking Hayes to describe his arrest procedures in detail. She wanted him to walk through step by step how he typically conducted a traffic stop or street encounter. Hayes answered carefully, trying to stick to department protocol and best practices. Then Rivers asked him to describe exactly what happened during David Thompson's arrest, minute by minute. Hayes repeated the story he had told that morning, but Rivers interrupted him frequently to ask for clarification about specific details. She asked about timing, positioning, and the exact sequence of events. Hayes found himself getting frustrated with the constant interruptions and detailed questions. This wasn't how police testimony usually went. Normally, he would tell his story once, answer a few basic questions, and be dismissed. Instead, Rivers was treating him like a suspect rather than a fellow law enforcement professional. The detective's frustration began to show in his voice as he answered Rivers's questions. He started speaking more quickly and with less patience. Several times, Judge Martinez had to remind him to slow down and speak clearly for the court reporter. Rivers then pulled out a document that made Hayes' stomach drop. It was a copy of his arrest report for David Thompson, but she had highlighted several sections in yellow marker. She asked Hayes to read specific passages aloud to the jury. As Hayes read his own words describing David's allegedly suspicious behavior, Rivers asked him to be more specific about what he meant. When he said David was acting nervous, she wanted to know exactly what nervous behaviors he had observed. When he said David was looking around suspiciously, she asked him to describe precisely what David was looking at and how often he looked. Hayes realized that his report, which had seemed perfectly adequate when he wrote it, was actually quite vague when examined closely. He had used general terms like suspicious behavior and appeared to be under the influence without providing specific details to support these conclusions. Rivers pressed harder, asking Hayes why he hadn't included more specific details in his report if David's behavior had been so obviously suspicious. She wondered aloud why an experienced officer like Hayes wouldn't document exactly what he had seen that made him think David was carrying drugs. The detective began to stumble over his words as he tried to add details to his story that he hadn't included in his original report. He claimed to remember specific things about David's behavior that he somehow hadn't thought to write down at the time. Rivers pointed out each inconsistency, asking Hayes to explain why his memory seemed to be improving months after the incident. Then Rivers opened her laptop and turned the screen toward Hayes. The courtroom, fell silent as she announced that she was about to show security camera footage from the night of David's arrest. Hayes felt his heart start racing as he realized what was about to happen. The footage began playing, showing David leaving the corner store and walking normally down Maple Street. Rivers paused the video frequently to ask Hayes questions about what they were seeing. She asked him to point out the suspicious behavior he had described in his testimony. Hayes stared at the screen in growing panic as he watched David walk calmly and normally down the street. There was no nervous looking around, no erratic behavior, no signs that David was under the influence of anything. The young man simply walked like any college student heading home from work. Rivers asked Hayes to identify the moment when David first noticed his patrol car. On the video, David looked up when Hayes called to him and immediately stopped walking. There was no attempt to run or avoid the officer. David appeared cooperative and calm throughout the entire encounter. The prosecutor paused the video at the moment when Hayes began his first search of David's backpack. She asked Hayes to describe what the jury was seeing. Reluctantly, Hayes confirmed that David was standing quietly while he searched through the bag, finding nothing suspicious. Then came the devastating moment. Rivers played the footage showing Hayes positioning David for a pat-down search. On the screen, it was clear that Hayes deliberately moved to block the camera's view of David's backpack for approximately 30 seconds. When he stepped away and searched the bag again, he suddenly found the drugs that hadn't been there before. Hayes watched his own actions on the screen with growing horror. What had seemed like a smooth, undetectable evidence planting at the time now looked obviously suspicious when viewed on security camera footage. The timing was too convenient, his positioning too deliberate. Rivers asked Hayes to explain why he had moved to block the camera's view of the backpack during the pat-down search. She wondered why an experienced officer would position himself in a way that prevented the camera from documenting his actions. Hayes stammered that it wasn't intentional, that he was just following proper search procedures. But Rivers wasn't finished. She pulled out a folder containing information about Hayes's other recent arrests. She had found 12 cases in the past 3 years where Hayes had arrested young men for drug possession under similar circumstances. In 10 of those cases, the dashboard camera had malfunctioned or been turned off during the arrest. Hayes felt the walls closing in as Rivers read the statistics to the jury. She asked him to explain this pattern of camera failures. She wondered how it was possible that his dashboard camera worked perfectly most of the time, but always seemed to malfunction during drug arrests. The detective's answers became increasingly defensive and angry. He insisted that equipment failures were common, and that he had no control over when cameras stopped working. But his explanations sounded weak and unconvincing, especially after the jury had just watched him deliberately block a security camera during David's arrest. Rivers then asked Hayes about the specific procedures for documenting evidence. She wanted to know why the evidence bag containing the drugs found in David's backpack had some irregularities in its chain of custody documentation. Hayes claimed he didn't remember any problems with the evidence handling. The prosecutor produced the actual evidence bag and asked Hayes to examine it. She pointed out that the seal had been broken and resealed at some point after the initial documentation. She asked Hayes to explain when and why this had happened. Hayes stared at the evidence bag with mounting panic. He had been so focused on planting the drugs and making the arrest that he hadn't been as careful as usual with the documentation. The broken seal was evidence that someone had tampered with the bag after it was first processed. Rivers asked Hayes directly if he had opened the evidence bag after it was initially sealed. She wanted to know if he had added anything to the bag or removed anything from it. Hayes denied tampering with the evidence, but his voice was shaking now and sweat was visible on his forehead. The courtroom was completely silent as the confrontation between Rivers and Hayes intensified. Everyone could see that something significant was happening, though not everyone understood exactly what it was. The police officers in the gallery looked uncomfortable, while the reporters were taking notes frantically. Judge Martinez watched the exchange with growing concern. She had never seen a prosecutor attack their own witness so aggressively. She was beginning to understand that this case was about much more than simple drug possession. Hayes was now visibly angry and frustrated. 15 years of getting away with evidence planting and false testimony were crashing down around him in a single afternoon. He felt betrayed by the prosecutor who was supposed to be on his side. He felt exposed and vulnerable in a way he had never experienced before. Rivers continued her methodical destruction of Hayes's credibility, asking question after question that highlighted the inconsistencies in his story and the implausibility of his explanations. With each answer, Hayes sounded less like a professional police officer and more like a criminal trying to cover up his crimes. The detective's composure was completely gone now. His face was red with anger and embarrassment. His voice was rising as he answered Rivers' questions. Judge Martinez finally called for a 15-minute recess after watching Detective Hayes become increasingly agitated on the witness stand. His face had turned deep red, and his hands were visibly shaking as Prosecutor Kelly Rivers continued her devastating cross-examination. The judge was concerned that Hayes might have a medical episode if the questioning continued without a break. As the courtroom emptied for the recess, Hayes stumbled down from the witness stand feeling dizzy and disoriented. 15 years of lies and corruption were catching up with him all at once. The security camera footage had been bad enough, but Rivers seemed to have information about other cases, other arrests, other times when he had planted evidence or falsified reports. Hayes looked around the courtroom and saw the faces of people staring at him. Some looked shocked, others looked disgusted, and a few looked angry. The police officers who had come to watch were avoiding eye contact with him now. His reputation, which had taken years to build, was being destroyed in a single afternoon. Rivers gathered her papers calmly, showing no emotion despite the bombshell she had just dropped on the courtroom. She had known this moment would come, and she was prepared for Hayes's reaction. She had seen corrupt officials before when they were finally confronted with evidence of their crimes. They usually went through anger, denial, and desperation before finally accepting their fate. David Thompson sat at the defense table looking stunned. For months he had been telling everyone who would listen that the drugs weren't his, that he had been set up by the police officer. Most people had assumed he was just another criminal trying to avoid responsibility for his actions. Now suddenly his story was being proven true in front of a packed courtroom. David's parents held each other tightly in the front row, tears streaming down their faces. They had believed in their son's innocence from the beginning, but they had also been terrified that he would be convicted and sent to prison. The security camera footage and Rivers's questioning had given them hope for the first time since their son's arrest. During the recess, Hayes found himself alone in the hallway outside the courtroom. Other police officers who had been friendly with him that morning were now keeping their distance. Word was spreading quickly through the courthouse about what was happening in Judge Martinez's courtroom, and Hayes could feel people staring at him as they walked by. Hayes pulled out his cell phone and tried calling his union representative again. This time he got through, but the conversation didn't go well. The representative had already heard about the trial and was reluctant to offer much support until he could review the evidence. He advised Hayes to remain calm and stick to his story, but his tone suggested he wasn't optimistic about the outcome. The detective also tried calling his supervisor at the police department. The captain was in a meeting, but his assistant said she would give him the message. Hayes could hear voices in the background, and he suspected that news of his courtroom disaster was already reaching the department. As Hayes stood in the hallway trying to compose himself, he noticed Rivers walking toward the water fountain near the elevators. She was alone, having sent her assistant back to the office to retrieve additional files. This was the first time Hayes had been alone with the prosecutor since the trial began. Hayes felt a surge of anger as he watched Rivers calmly drinking water and checking her phone. This woman was destroying his life, his career, and his reputation. She was treating him like a criminal instead of a fellow law enforcement professional. In his mind, she was the enemy, not the person who was supposed to be working with him to convict criminals. The detective walked toward Rivers, his anger building with each step. He had spent 15 years believing that he was above the law, that his badge protected him from consequences. The idea that a prosecutor would turn against him and expose his crimes was both shocking and infuriating. Rivers noticed Hayes approaching and looked up from her phone. She could see the anger in his eyes and the tension in his body language. She had dealt with hostile witnesses before, but something about Hayes's demeanor made her feel uncomfortable. She glanced around the hallway, noting that there were other people nearby but no one close enough to intervene quickly if something happened. Hayes stopped about 3 feet away from Rivers and stared at her for a moment without speaking. His breathing was heavy and his fists were clenched at his sides. The prosecutor maintained eye contact, refusing to show fear despite her growing concern about his mental state. Then Hayes spoke, his voice low and filled with venom. He told Rivers that she had no idea what she was doing, that she was destroying the career of a good police officer who had dedicated his life to protecting the community. He accused her of caring more about criminals than victims, of being willing to let drug dealers go free just to make a name for herself. Rivers listened to Hayes' accusations without responding. She could see that he was on the edge of losing control completely, and she didn't want to say anything that might push him over that edge. She glanced toward the courtroom doors, hoping someone would come out and interrupt the confrontation. Hayes continued his verbal attack, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. He accused Rivers of being naive about police work, of not understanding the realities of dealing with criminals on the street. He said she lived in an ivory tower, making judgments about situations she had never faced herself. The detective's anger was building toward a dangerous level. He felt cornered and desperate, like an animal being hunted. Everything he had worked for was being taken away by this prosecutor who seemed determined to destroy him. His rational mind was being overwhelmed by rage and desperation. Rivers finally spoke, her voice calm and professional. She told Hayes that his behavior was inappropriate and that he should return to the courtroom for the continuation of his testimony. She reminded him that there were proper channels for addressing concerns about prosecutorial conduct, and that confronting her in a courthouse hallway was not one of them. Hayes exploded at Rivers's calm response. He stepped closer to her, invading her personal space and forcing her to back up against the water fountain. His face was inches from hers as he unleashed a torrent of threats and accusations. His voice echoed off the marble walls of the courthouse hallway. Several people in the hallway stopped and stared at the confrontation. A few court employees moved closer, unsure whether they should intervene. Hayes was a police officer, after all, and most people were reluctant to get involved in what appeared to be a professional disagreement between law enforcement and a prosecutor. Rivers tried to step around Hayes and walk back toward the courtroom, but he moved to block her path. He was no longer trying to hide his anger or maintain any pretense of professionalism. The mask had come off completely, revealing the corrupt and dangerous person he really was underneath his police uniform. Hayes began using language that shocked even the courthouse employees, who had heard it all before. He made threats about what would happen to Rivers' career if she continued her attack on him. He suggested that she would regret making him look bad in front of the jury. His words were becoming more personal and more menacing. The prosecutor realized that Hayes was completely out of control and potentially dangerous. She could see that his anger was beyond anything rational or professional. This wasn't just about being caught in lies on the witness stand anymore. This was about a corrupt police officer who was facing the end of his career and was looking for someone to blame. Rivers tried once more to walk away from the confrontation, but Hayes grabbed her arm to stop her. The physical contact crossed a line that even the onlookers couldn't ignore. Several people moved closer, and one court security officer started walking in their direction. Hayes was past the point of caring about consequences or witnesses. 15 years of getting away with corruption had convinced him that he was untouchable. He had never been held accountable for his actions before, and he couldn't accept that it was happening now. His anger and desperation were about to lead him to make the biggest mistake of his life. Rivers looked directly at Hayes and spoke firmly, telling him to remove his hand from her arm immediately. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years in courtrooms dealing with difficult people, but Hayes was no longer listening to reason or responding to authority. The confrontation in the courthouse hallway was about to escalate beyond words and threats. Hayes' loss of control was complete, and he was about to commit an act that would destroy any remaining chance he had of salvaging his career or his freedom. Justice was about to be served in a way that no one in the courthouse could have expected. The courthouse hallway fell completely silent as Detective Robert Hayes grabbed Prosecutor Kelly Rivers' arm. The few people who had been walking by stopped in their tracks, sensing that something serious was about to happen. The marble walls and high ceilings of the old building seemed to amplify the tension in the air. Rivers looked down at Hayes' hand gripping her arm, then back up at his face. His eyes were wild with rage and desperation. She could see that he was completely beyond reason now. This wasn't just an angry police officer anymore. This was a dangerous man who felt cornered, and was lashing out at anyone he could blame for his downfall. The prosecutor spoke clearly and firmly, telling Hayes to let go of her immediately. Her voice carried throughout the hallway, and several more people turned to watch the confrontation. A court security officer who had been standing near the elevators began walking quickly in their direction, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. Hayes seemed to snap back to reality for just a moment when he heard Rivers's commanding voice. He looked around and noticed for the first time that people were watching them. Some were court employees he recognized, others were attorneys and civilians who had business in the courthouse. All of them were staring at him with expressions of shock and concern. For a brief second, Hayes seemed to realize what he was doing. His grip on Rivers's arm loosened slightly, and his expression showed a flicker of awareness about how badly he was behaving. 15 years of police training told him to step back, apologize, and walk away from the situation before it got worse. But the rational part of Hayes's mind was overwhelmed by rage and humiliation. Rivers had destroyed his reputation and his career in front of a packed courtroom. She had exposed him as a liar and a corrupt police officer. In his twisted thinking, she deserved whatever happened to her next. Rivers tried to pull her arm free, but Hayes tightened his grip and stepped even closer to her. She could smell the coffee on his breath and see the sweat beading on his forehead. His face was red with anger and his breathing was shallow and rapid. She realized that this situation was about to become much more dangerous. The prosecutor had dealt with hostile witnesses and angry defendants before, but she had never been physically threatened by a police officer in a courthouse. She knew that Hayes was armed, even though weapons weren't supposed to be carried in the courtroom. Police officers were usually exempt from the metal detectors that other visitors had to pass through. Hayes began speaking again, his voice low and threatening. He told Rivers that she had made a big mistake by going after him. He said she didn't understand who she was dealing with or what kind of connections he had in the police department and the courthouse. His words were meant to intimidate her, but they only made her more determined to see justice done. The security officer was getting closer now, speaking into his radio as he approached. Other court personnel were also moving toward the confrontation, though most seemed uncertain about what they should do. Hayes was still a police officer after all, and intervening in a dispute involving law enforcement could be complicated. Rivers could see help approaching, but she also realized that Hayes was becoming more agitated as he noticed the attention they were attracting. She tried to speak calmly to him, suggesting that they return to the courtroom and finish his testimony in a professional manner. She reminded him that his behavior was being witnessed by people who knew him and respected him. But Hayes was beyond listening to reasonable suggestions. He felt betrayed not just by Rivers, but by the entire system he had served for 15 years. He had planted evidence and lied in reports because he believed he was serving justice. He had convinced himself that the people he arrested were guilty of something, even if he couldn't prove it legally. In Hayes's distorted thinking, he was the victim in this situation. Rivers was the one destroying justice by defending criminals and attacking honest police officers. The security cameras that exposed his evidence planting were unfair surveillance. The witnesses who contradicted his testimony were unreliable. Everyone was against him except the truth. The detective's grip on Rivers' arm became painful as his anger intensified. She tried once more to pull away, but he yanked her back toward him with enough force to make her stumble. The sound of her heels scraping against the marble floor echoed through the hallway, and several witnesses gasped in shock. The security officer was close enough now to speak to Hayes directly. He identified himself and asked the detective to release Rivers immediately. His voice was professional but firm, the tone of someone used to dealing with tense situations. He kept his hand near his radio, ready to call for backup if necessary. Hayes looked at the security officer with a mixture of anger and disbelief. In his mind, this was a private conversation between law enforcement professionals. The idea that a courthouse security guard would interfere with a police detective was insulting and infuriating. Rivers used the momentary distraction to try pulling free again, but Hayes's attention snapped back to her immediately. He seemed to take her attempt to escape as another betrayal, another sign that everyone was against him. His face contorted with rage as he realized that his career and his life were truly over. What happened next shocked everyone in the hallway, including Hayes himself. In a moment of complete loss of control, he raised his free hand and struck Rivers across the face with an open palm. The sound of the slap echoed off the courthouse walls like a gunshot, and Rivers stumbled backward from the force of the blow. The hallway erupted in chaos as witnesses reacted to what they had just seen. Several people shouted in shock and anger. The security officer immediately called for backup while rushing toward Hayes. Court employees who had been hesitant to intervene before now had no choice but to act. Rivers caught herself against the water fountain, her hand moving instinctively to her cheek where Hayes had struck her. She looked at the detective with a mixture of shock and determination. Even after being assaulted, her first thought was about making sure there were enough witnesses to testify about what had happened. Hayes seemed stunned by his own actions. For a moment, he stood frozen in place, staring at his hand as if he couldn't believe what he had just done. The rage that had driven him to violence was suddenly replaced by a cold realization of what he had just thrown away. The security officer reached Hayes and immediately began giving him commands to put his hands behind his back. Other court personnel surrounded them, creating a barrier between Hayes and Rivers. Someone called for medical assistance, though Rivers insisted she was not seriously injured. Hayes initially resisted the security officer's commands, still not fully accepting that he was now the one being arrested. He had spent 15 years putting handcuffs on other people, never imagining that he would find himself on the receiving end of police action. The reversal was too dramatic and sudden for him to process. More security officers arrived within minutes, along with courthouse police and paramedics. The hallway that had been quiet during the recess was now filled with uniformed personnel, flashing lights, and radio chatter. News of the incident was already spreading throughout the building. Rivers declined medical treatment but agreed to be photographed for evidence of the assault. The red mark on her cheek would fade within hours, but the photos would be permanent evidence of Hayes' loss of control. She also gave a detailed statement to investigators about what had led up to the attack. As Hayes was finally handcuffed and led away, he looked back at Rivers with an expression that mixed hatred and disbelief. He still couldn't accept that his actions had consequences, that his badge didn't protect him from accountability. He had spent so many years above the law that facing justice seemed impossible. The assault in the courthouse hallway had been witnessed by more than a dozen people, including court employees, attorneys, and civilians. There would be no question about what had happened or who was responsible. Hayes had destroyed his remaining credibility and his freedom in a single moment of uncontrolled rage. Rivers watched as Hayes was led away, knowing that justice was finally being served. The man who had destroyed so many innocent lives with his planted evidence and false testimony was now facing his own reckoning. The system he had corrupted for 15 years was finally working the way it was supposed to work. The aftermath of Detective Robert Hayes' assault on Prosecutor Kelly Rivers moved with shocking speed through the courthouse. Within minutes of the attack, the entire building was buzzing with news of what had happened. Court clerks, bailiffs, attorneys, and judges were all talking about the unprecedented incident in hushed, disbelieving tones. Hayes found himself in a holding cell in the basement of the courthouse, the same building where he had testified in hundreds of cases over his 15-year career. The irony wasn't lost on him as he sat on the hard bench, still wearing his court suit but now with his hands cuffed behind his back. The cell was small and windowless, designed to hold defendants temporarily before their court appearances. The detective's mind was reeling as he tried to process what had just happened. Less than an hour ago, he had been a respected police officer testifying in what he thought would be a routine drug case. Now he was under arrest for assaulting a prosecutor in front of multiple witnesses. His career was over, his reputation was destroyed, and his freedom was in serious jeopardy. Hayes kept replaying the moment when he had slapped Rivers, trying to understand what had driven him to such an extreme action. He had been angry before, frustrated by difficult witnesses and hostile attorneys, but he had never lost control like that. The pressure of having his corruption exposed had pushed him beyond his breaking point. Meanwhile, Rivers was in the district attorney's office giving a detailed statement about the assault. Despite the trauma of being attacked, she remained focused on making sure that Hayes faced appropriate consequences for his actions. She described not just the physical assault, but also the threatening language and intimidating behavior that had led up to it. The DA himself had come to the courthouse as soon as he heard about the incident. This wasn't just any assault case. It involved one of his own prosecutors being attacked by a police officer during a trial. The political and legal implications were enormous, and he knew that every decision would be scrutinized by the media and the public. Rivers also had to deal with the medical and legal protocols following an assault. She was photographed to document her injuries, though the red mark on her cheek was already starting to fade. She gave statements to multiple investigators and had to answer questions about whether she felt safe returning to work. Back in Judge Martinez's courtroom, chaos had erupted when news of the assault reached the jury and spectators. David Thompson and his family were trying to understand what the incident meant for his case. His defense attorney was scrambling to figure out how Hayes's arrest would affect the trial proceedings. Judge Martinez had immediately declared a recess when she learned about the assault. She had presided over thousands of cases during her 12 years on the bench, but she had never dealt with anything like this. A police officer assaulting a prosecutor during a trial was unprecedented in her experience. The judge had to make several immediate decisions. Should the trial continue with Hayes under arrest? Could his previous testimony still be considered valid? How should she handle the jury, who had witnessed Hayes's increasingly erratic behavior on the witness stand? These were questions that weren't covered in any legal textbook. Within 2 hours of the assault, Hayes was formally charged with multiple crimes. The assault charge was obvious, but investigators were also looking at charges related to civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and official misconduct. The attack on Rivers had been so public and so clearly documented that prosecutors had an airtight case. The police department was also moving quickly to distance itself from Hayes's actions. His supervisor, Captain Rodriguez, held an emergency press conference to announce that Hayes had been suspended without pay, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. Rodriguez emphasized that Hayes's behavior didn't represent the values or standards of the department. The police union found itself in an impossible position. Union representatives were obligated to provide legal support for Hayes, but his assault on a prosecutor in front of witnesses made him impossible to defend. The union's lawyer met with Hayes briefly, but advised him that his best option might be to accept a plea deal if one was offered. Rivers made a decision that surprised many people who knew her. Despite being the victim of Hayes's attack, she insisted that David Thompson's trial should continue. She wanted to finish what she had started and make sure that Hayes's corruption was fully exposed in court. She refused to let his violence derail the pursuit of justice. Judge Martinez agreed to continue the trial after consulting with legal experts and reviewing precedent cases. Hayes's testimony would remain part of the record, but his arrest and the circumstances surrounding it would certainly influence how the jury viewed his credibility. The judge instructed the jury about the incident and told them to focus only on the evidence presented in court. The trial resumed the next morning with a dramatically different atmosphere. Hayes's empty chair at the prosecution table was a constant reminder of how quickly everything had changed. Rivers appeared in court with a slight bruise on her cheek, but otherwise seemed determined to carry on with her case. The defense attorney, James Wright, found himself in the unusual position of having the prosecution do most of his work for him. Rivers had already demolished Hayes's credibility before the assault, and his violent outburst had only reinforced the impression that he was capable of the corruption she had alleged. Rivers completed her case by presenting additional evidence of Hayes's pattern of questionable arrests. She showed the jury records from multiple cases where Hayes had arrested young men under similar circumstances, often with camera malfunctions and inconsistencies in evidence handling. The pattern was clear and convincing. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a verdict of not guilty on all charges against David Thompson. The foreman explained that they had concluded the drugs were planted by Hayes and that David was innocent of any wrongdoing. The security camera footage and Hayes's subsequent behavior had convinced them that the detective was lying. David Thompson broke down in tears when the verdict was read. After months of living under the shadow of a felony conviction, he was finally free to continue his education and rebuild his life. His parents embraced him in the courtroom, crying with relief and gratitude. Rivers felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she watched David reunite with his family. This was why she had become a prosecutor, to ensure that justice was served and innocent people were protected. Hayes's assault on her had been traumatic, but seeing David vindicated made it worthwhile. The news media had gathered outside the courthouse to cover the story of the police officer who had assaulted a prosecutor during a trial. Rivers gave a brief statement emphasizing that the justice system had worked as it should, holding a corrupt officer accountable for his crimes while protecting an innocent defendant. Hayes, meanwhile, was transferred to the county jail to await his own trial. The holding cell had been replaced by a larger cell with other inmates, many of whom recognized him as the police officer who had arrested them or their friends over the years. His reception was not friendly. The detective's fall from grace was complete and irreversible. In less than 24 hours, he had gone from being a respected police officer to being a criminal defendant facing serious charges. His corruption had finally caught up with him, and his violent reaction to being exposed had sealed his fate. The courthouse community was still talking about the incident days later. Many people who had worked with Hayes over the years were shocked by his behavior, though some admitted they had always suspected something wasn't right about his unusually high conviction rate and perfect arrest record. Rivers returned to work the next day, determined not to let Hayes' assault change how she approached her job. She knew that there might be other corrupt officers out there, and she was more committed than ever to making sure they faced justice. Hayes' attack had shown her that she was on the right path, even if it was a dangerous one. 6 months after Detective Robert Hayes slapped Prosecutor Kelly Rivers in the courthouse hallway, he sat in a different courtroom as a defendant rather than a witness. The man who had once commanded respect from judges and juries now wore an orange jumpsuit and sat between two public defenders who had been assigned to his case. Hayes' own trial had become one of the most closely watched cases in the city's history. Every major news outlet covered the proceedings, and the courtroom was packed daily with reporters, police officers, and members of the public who wanted to see justice served. The case had become a symbol of police accountability and the fight against corruption. The evidence against Hayes was overwhelming. The security cameras in the courthouse hallway had captured his assault on Rivers from multiple angles, leaving no doubt about what had happened. More than a dozen witnesses had seen the attack, and many had given detailed statements about Hayes' threatening behavior leading up to the violence. But the assault charge was just the beginning of Hayes' legal troubles. Rivers' investigation into his corruption had opened the floodgates, leading to a massive review of his past cases. The district attorney's office had formed a special task force to examine every arrest Hayes had made in the past 5 years, looking for patterns of evidence planting and false testimony. The task force's findings were devastating. They identified at least 27 cases where Hayes appeared to have planted evidence or falsified police reports. Young men who had been convicted on Hayes' testimony were being released from prison as their cases were overturned one by one. Families who had been torn apart by wrongful convictions were finally getting justice. David Thompson had become something of a celebrity since his acquittal. He had returned to college and was now studying law, inspired by Rivers' dedication to justice. He spoke at community meetings about police reform and had started a support group for other victims of Hayes' corruption. His case had become the catalyst for broader changes in how the police department operated. The internal investigation at the police department had revealed that Hayes' supervisors had failed to properly oversee his work despite several red flags. His unusually high arrest rate and perfect conviction record should have triggered closer scrutiny, but department bureaucracy and Hayes' reputation had protected him from meaningful oversight. Captain Rodriguez, Hayes' immediate supervisor, had been demoted and transferred to a desk job after the investigation revealed his failure to properly monitor Hayes' activities. Several other officers who had worked with Hayes were also disciplined, though none were found to have directly participated in his corruption. The police union had eventually distanced itself from Hayes after the full scope of his crimes became clear. While they provided basic legal representation as required, they made public statements condemning his actions and supporting reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. Hayes had become too toxic for even his former allies to defend. Hayes' defense team had tried several strategies to minimize his punishment. They argued that the stress of police work had contributed to his mental breakdown, that he had served the community faithfully for most of his career, and that his actions were aberrations rather than a pattern of behavior. None of these arguments impressed the judge or jury. The prosecution led by a different attorney since Rivers couldn't prosecute her own attacker, presented a methodical case showing how Hayes had systematically violated his oath and abused his power. They brought in expert witnesses to explain how evidence planting worked and called several of Hayes's victims to testify about how his lies had destroyed their lives. One of the most powerful moments in Hayes's trial came when Carlos Martinez, the teenager whose case Rivers had reviewed during her investigation, testified about his wrongful conviction. Carlos had spent 18 months in juvenile detention because of Hayes's planted evidence, missing his senior year of high school and losing a college scholarship. His testimony brought several jurors to tears. Rivers herself testified about the assault and Hayes's threatening behavior. She remained professional and composed on the witness stand, describing the incident in detail while explaining how Hayes's corruption had prompted her investigation. Her testimony was devastating to Hayes's already weak defense. The jury in Hayes's case deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. He was convicted of assault, civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and multiple counts of official misconduct. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison, noting that Hayes had betrayed the public trust and caused immeasurable harm to innocent people. Hayes showed no emotion when the sentence was read. He had aged considerably during the months since his arrest, and his once confident demeanor had been replaced by a hollow, defeated expression. His wife had divorced him shortly after his arrest, and his children had changed their last name to avoid the stigma of being associated with his crimes. The impact of Hayes's case extended far beyond his personal punishment. The police department implemented new oversight procedures, including mandatory body cameras for all officers and regular audits of arrest patterns. The district attorney's office created a new unit specifically dedicated to investigating allegations of police misconduct. Rivers had been promoted to deputy district attorney in recognition of her courage in exposing Hayes's corruption. She continued to handle high-profile cases, but made police accountability one of her primary focuses. She regularly spoke at law schools and police academies about the importance of integrity in law enforcement. The city also faced numerous civil lawsuits from Hayes's victims, ultimately paying out millions of dollars in settlements to people who had been wrongfully convicted. While money couldn't undo the damage Hayes had caused, it provided some compensation for the years of freedom and opportunity that his victims had lost. David Thompson graduated from law school 3 years after his ordeal and was hired by the public defender's office. His first case involved representing a young man who claimed he had been framed by a police officer. David's experience with Hayes had taught him to never automatically trust law enforcement testimony, and his thorough investigation helped expose another corrupt officer. The courthouse hallway where Hayes had assaulted Rivers was eventually renamed in honor of prosecutors who had fought for justice in difficult circumstances. A small plaque commemorated Rivers's courage in exposing police corruption, despite personal threats and violence. It served as a reminder that the justice system only worked when people were willing to stand up for what was right. Hayes served his full sentence in state prison, where his status as a former police officer made him a target for other inmates. He spent most of his time in protective custody, isolated from the general population for his own safety. The man who had once commanded respect and fear was now just another convicted felon, trying to survive behind bars. When Hayes was finally released after 8 years, he found a world that had moved on without him. Police reform had become a national movement, with Hayes's case often cited as an example of why oversight and accountability were essential. Body cameras were now standard equipment, and prosecutors were more willing to challenge questionable police testimony. Rivers had retired from the district attorney's office by the time of Hayes's release and was teaching law at a local university. She had written a book about her experience exposing police corruption, and the case had become a staple in criminal justice textbooks. Her courage in standing up to Hayes had inspired a new generation of prosecutors to prioritize justice over conviction. The story of Hayes's downfall had become a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of unchecked power. His 15-year career of planting evidence and falsifying reports had finally caught up with him, proving that no one was truly above the law. Justice had been delayed, but it had ultimately been served. David Thompson had gone on to become a successful defense attorney and advocate for criminal justice reform. He often thought about the night he was arrested by Hayes and how different his life might have been if Rivers hadn't been assigned to his case. Her dedication to the truth had saved not just his future, but the futures of many other innocent people who might have fallen victim to Hayes's corruption. The courthouse where it all happened continued to serve the community, but with better oversight and accountability measures in place. The system wasn't perfect, but Hayes's case had shown that it was possible to hold corrupt officials accountable when brave people were willing to stand up for justice. The truth had finally surfaced, just as Rivers had always believed it would.